The reason that we're doing this and we're talking about terrorism today is that June 23rd marks the anniversary of one of the worst, in fact, the worst, incidents of terrorism to affect Canada. On June 23rd, 1985, Air India Flight 182 was destroyed when a bomb exploded within the aircraft. 329 lives were lost that day, the majority of them Canadians. One issue which we need to remember in all of this is it still stands as the worst incident of terrorism that has hit Canada. And today we mark 30 years since that devastating incident and that major tragedy for our nation. But the threat of terrorism has gone beyond what we saw in 1985. It has evolved, it has changed, and it continues to change and evolve. With me today is Phil Gurski. Phil has spent time working with the federal government and has also spent a lot of time, a lot of research on terrorism and counterterrorism in terms of how it affects Canada as well as many of our international partners. Welcome, Phil.
Thanks, Kabi.
So, Phil, one of the things that we've talked about is how the whole threat has evolved. And in 30 years, it certainly has changed. How do you think it has changed, and where do you think it's going to go for us in the next 30 years?
It's a great question, and I like the way you introduced our session today by talking about Air India. Not only was it the single greatest attack in Canadian history, it was the single greatest attack in world history prior to 9/11. People forget that. And I think we forget it for a number of reasons. It was 30 years ago. It was at a different time. The aircraft exploded outside of Canada. There wasn't that immediacy effect that you have. And if you think of what was happening at the time in 1985, you had actually a number of terrorist or extremist threats within this country. So prior to Air India, you had other incidents that were linked to Sikh extremism in Canada, threatening politicians, for example. You also had a series of attacks by Armenian extremists here. We had an attack on the Turkish embassy. We had the assassination of a military attaché in 1981. So we certainly had a number of things that were occurring at the time. 30 years later, we're fixated on what we call the Al-Qaeda threat, or the Islamic State threat, also called Islamist extremism. There's a variety of phrases that are used to describe it. What we have to bear in mind is the threats that we faced 30 years ago may not be as manifest and as obvious as they were back then, but they haven't disappeared. I was reading an op-ed piece in a South Asian newspaper recently that said the threat from Sikh extremism hasn't disappeared, it hasn't gone away. And you ask yourself, well, why would that be? Well, the grievances or the reasons that led to that environment that facilitated Air India were the independence of a Sikh homeland, Khalistan. They haven't got that homeland. They haven't got the independence. So the desire for that maybe perhaps has waned a bit over the years, but it hasn't gone away completely. So when we're fixated on a certain threat, and justifiably so right now, because that is the current number one threat, we have to bear in mind there's other threats out there.
That's very interesting. It has a lot of parallels with the United Kingdom because, of course, the issue with extremism and terrorism originating from Ireland certainly went through ebbs and flows, and post the initial peace agreement, of course, many thought that that threat had disappeared. Yet it has popped up by certain splinter groups, by the actions of certain splinter groups several times. And I think that's a great takeaway message. One is the fact that although things have changed and we've seen some new actors in this space, we've seen the rise of some Islamist linked groups, but we've also seen the rise of other groups. The threat from some of the groups whom we've seen in the past hasn't got away. What other groups are out there that we should be concerned about?
Well, you look at the events in Charleston, South Carolina in the last couple of days, the horrendous killing of 9 people in a church. So currently you always have that sort of fringe white supremacist or Aryan nation threat that has never gone away. And if you've seen, some scholars in the United States have stated quite categorically that if you look at the past 20 or 30 years south of the border, the vast majority of victims of terrorism, they call it domestic terrorism in the United States, haven't been from the Al-Qaeda types or from American Muslims radicalized to violence, but have been from your sovereigntists, your freemen, your Aryan nation or your white supremacists. So those people never went away either. And you mentioned the Irish problem, which I find fascinating. It's been with us for decades. It appears to be in a lull, and I'm certainly no expert on the Irish problem, but you do hear about groups that do still want to use violence. Because terrorism, if you reduce it to its bare essentials, it's about grievance and the conviction that violence is the only way to achieve some kind of resolution to that grievance. The grievances don't go away. Certain populations may choose not to act upon those grievances in a violent fashion, but as long as the grievances still remain, they can easily remorph into a violent stage.
Yes, that is very interesting. We've actually talked now about a number of different groups, from Air India with Sikh extremists. In a recent op-ed we had in the Ottawa Citizen, we talked about some of the history Canada has had with the FLQ, for instance. You talked about some of the Armenian incidents involving people of Armenian descent. We've talked about Ireland. We've talked about some of the other threats that we face from the right-wing groups. I think the main message that we've seen, and even in our own research, is suggesting it's never limited to, or it's never the reason for terrorism isn't down to one race or religion or ethnic group. It's a wide variety of sources.
Absolutely, and sometimes from the most unexpected sources. If you look at what's happening in Myanmar, Burma these days with the Rohingya, tragic situation with hundreds of thousands of refugees. Why did that all begin the last couple of years? Well, not exclusively, but in part due to a radical Buddhist movement that wanted to basically erase the Rohingya Muslims from Myanmar. And you think Buddhist extremism must be an oxymoron. And yet we have a firebrand cleric who is saying things and doing things in that country to elicit hatred and to convince people that they should act in a violent manner. So you're right. I mean, it's not exclusive to an ethnic group. It's not exclusive to a religious group. Hatred can occur anywhere. And when people think that the only way to achieve their version of a resolution of a grievance is through violence, then it can certainly surface.
That certainly is backed up by the research we did back in 2011 about some of the issues pertaining to radicalization in particular, and these extremist views and the fact that they could come from anywhere and they could affect anyone. I guess the challenge really for us is, in terms of tackling some of these problems, obviously we need to deal with people who are at the risk of radicalization or at the risk of taking their extremist views into violent action. But how we do that certainly will have an impact, won't it?
Absolutely. At the end of the day, Kabi, you have to remind yourself that while terrorism and violent extremism and radicalization are real issues, they are happening as we're here speaking today in Ottawa, you have to remind yourself that it's still a relatively small problem. And if you sort of the analogy of, hitting an ant with a hammer. So if you take out a large tool to deal with a relatively small problem, you're probably going to make the problem worse. So deal with the problem, identify where it is, get the right resources in place, be they agencies, community groups, or whomever, but do so in a way that doesn't make the problem worse or alienates the very community upon which you're relying to help.
And I think that's a great point. That's certainly been brought up several times in discussions, and we've seen papers on this as well, that we have to be careful not to alienate these communities. At the end of the day, many of these extremist groups have in their manifestos and their agendas, regardless of where they come from, this entire perception of persecution.
Absolutely.
That you're being targeted by the authorities, that you're being targeted by others. So unless we deal with that and make sure that we don't feed that persecution, we risk alienating whole communities, out of whom it might just be a tiny, tiny, tiny proportion who ever go out into active, violent actions as part of an extremist viewpoint.
Exactly, and research has shown that the first people to identify someone at risk of going down a violent path are often families and friends. And we've seen in the UK where some perhaps well-intentioned but maybe not well put in practice programs have alienated the very communities that the authorities rely upon to say, I think my son is going down a certain pathway, or I know someone who's saying certain things or is embracing a certain ideology. And if those people feel they cannot go to the authorities for whatever reason, whether they're feeling picked upon or alienated or securitized, that's a huge blow to our efforts to deal with this thing.
Well, one of the things we have noticed in Canada, of course, is we technically have had a much lower incidence of terrorism than some comparable nations. Part of that's our history, but certainly our research suggests that we do some things right in Canada. What do you think we do right, Phil, when it comes to combating terrorism in Canada?
I think for some people in 2015, multiculturalism is a dirty word. I grew up in the era of multiculturalism in the 1970s under the Trudeau governments. And whatever criticism you may have, and certainly there are some valid criticisms over sort of how we've done it pretty well. And I think the evidence that that's so is that we have lots of people want to come here. They want to become Canadians. And as you said, we've had rather lower incidences of violence and extremism. So whatever it is we're doing, and I'm not sure we know what we're doing or how we're doing it, it appears to be working well. We seem to be able to integrate people more or less. There are going to be your sort of elements that don't work out so well. And there are issues now, whether it's wearing a niqab during citizenship ceremonies or other issues that have come to the fore. Overall, the situation is pretty good.
It's interesting, our own research when we worked on issues of radicalization in 2011, one of the themes that came out really strongly was when the questions asked to Canadians of different origins, how do they feel about being able to achieve high office, being a CEO of a company, being a member of parliament, being a judge, someone who's achieved in society. Over and above that level, the number of people or the percentage of people who respond and say, yes, I believe I can achieve that, I feel like I can achieve that in Canadian society, that's very high. And that, I think, speaks a lot to integration in Canada.
Absolutely. I mean, we don't want to say that anybody can achieve anything. There certainly are other elements that go into whether it's education background or personality type or opportunity. But generally speaking, as you said, we seem to have achieved that. The mayor of Calgary is a practicing Muslim. We've had Sikh members of parliament. We've had a black police chief in Toronto. I mean, who would have said that 20 years ago? So I think the model, whatever it is and however it's working, it is working. It doesn't mean we have to not tinker with it or to re-examine how we did it and what we want to do in the future. But what we've achieved has to be recognized.
Well, certainly another aspect in all of this, which we've written about in the past, has been the work of the intelligence services and the police forces. A variety of them. It's not just the RCMP who work on these. The case of the Toronto 18, and more recently, the attempted via rail bombing, certainly illustrate that our intelligence services and our law enforcement services are doing quite a lot to prevent these actors from fulfilling their violent intentions.
Obviously, I'm biased, having come from that background, but I think that Canadians have to recognize that they are doing a very, very good job. It only seems the headlines that you see are the RCMP or CSIS are the negative headlines. But you look at the cases that, as you say, via passenger rail, the Victoria plot, the Samosa plot here in Ottawa, the Toronto 18, et cetera, they're doing a very good job. They're doing their job properly. They're doing it within the bounds of Canadian law. And I think the greatest test of that is that we now have 4 successful trials in this country, either by judge or by judge and jury, in which it has been deemed that, yes, there was an evidentiary standard there that was met, and that these people were in fact guilty of plotting to commit terrorism. That, to me, is the gold standard.
And I think that's, again, as you point out, been some of the achievements we've had, which aren't always as heavily publicized as, say, some of the negative impacts. I would have to say, I agree with you. We have had some negative impacts, we have had some negative publicity, but I think overall, when we look at the way our intelligence services and our police forces operate, though they're not perfect, and when we compare them across the world, I think we're pretty lucky in Canada to have forces that work like that. Even when we talk about integration, as you mentioned, with Chief Mark Saunders being in place, the opportunities are there for people of whatever background to even work in those spaces in Canada.
Look, I had the honor of working with some amazing people over my career with CSIS, and they're just average Canadians, and they're from all walks of life. They're from all walks of ethnic backgrounds, academic backgrounds, family backgrounds, and they're an amazing group of people, and they have a passion for what they do. Do they make mistakes? Absolutely, because they're human.
Yes.
We're all going to make mistakes. But I mean, on the whole, you look at their record, it's pretty stellar, and I think we have to recognize that they are doing the job within the bounds of legislation, within the bounds of Canadian law, and they're doing it well.
Well, when we talk about some of the challenges that go with it, we just said it's not perfect. It's really good, but it's not perfect. What do you think we need to improve upon when it comes to protecting Canada from the threats of extremism and terrorism that we face today?
I think first and foremost, we have to do a better job of educating Canadians as to what is the nature of the threat, what does it look like, and be honest about it. Security services are wont to not divulge what they know and how they know it, and understand that. Maybe that's my role in retirement now, is to help with that. But I think Canadians have to know what it is we're facing. Because as I said, they're part of the solution as well. Whether it's identifying people, whether it's helping to work with people who are radicalizing, they're your first line of defense. It's not the RCMP and CSIS. And so the problem is that they haven't received that education. They haven't received that awareness training, if you will, of what is out there. That we haven't done so well. We're getting there.
Yes.
But it's a big country, and you have to bear in mind too that even as good as your security and law enforcement services are, they're still relatively small for a country the size of Canada. So I think that some efforts have been made. They've been very good efforts, but there's a lot more that has to be done.
We've certainly seen some police forces make some great strides in here. Certainly the Toronto Police Service in some of the work that they're doing. I know that the Calgary Police Service is also doing similar work, and other forces as well. But you're right, it's not perfect yet. We are still learning. The other area that concerns me a little bit is actually this whole question of social media. We happen to be on social media today. And we have been seeing a lot of activity on social media, particularly from extremist groups. And we're not talking just about those who are linked to the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda. Certainly all other, I shouldn't say all other, but many other extremist groups actively use social media. And one of the things that's always baffled me is it's almost a separation from the capabilities that many of these extremist groups use versus what, say, law enforcement or government would deploy in that same space. It almost seems like they're disturbingly astute at using social media and controlling that, not so much controlling, but being at the top of that social media conversation, much more so than government or law enforcement.
You know, you've made a really good point, and I don't think there's an answer to that challenge. Let's just, a few thoughts on it though. The State Department came out recently and said quite bald-facedly that we're losing badly. And we are. For some of the reasons you cited. When I was with government, for whatever reason, you're either precluded from using social media, or the approval processes take so long that in today's era of instantaneous messaging, a message 3 weeks later doesn't make any sense. On the other hand, I think we have to get to the point where we accept that everybody uses social media, including the extremists.
Yeah.
It's part and parcel of the modern world. Can we do a better job? Probably. But I sometimes think that we put too much emphasis on, social media is being used to recruit, or social media is being used to radicalize. It probably is. I'm sure it is. But I'm not sure that tackling that is the best response in terms of resources, in terms of money, in terms of just the effort you have to make to try and keep doing the whack-a-mole of who's out there. In fact, I remember I was in a conference a month ago with an academic who said, the extremists who are on Twitter and have their accounts erased, those accounts that are erased, that's a badge of honor. I've been taken down 20 times by Twitter. Well, I've been taken down 30 times by Twitter.
Right.
So social media is a reality.
Yep.
It's not going to change. It's going to evolve. And you'll see more apps tomorrow and more apps the week after. I don't think that's where the focus should be. We can certainly get better at getting our message out. But for the reasons we've already discussed, governments are sometimes hidebound to not do it in an instantaneous or real-time fashion. How you solve that one, I don't have an answer to that.
I think there's two areas for me of concern. I agree with you that while social media plays a role, it is not the be-all and end-all. But I think we do have to have some presence in there, and actually, maybe even more fundamentally, an understanding of it. And my concern, similar to yours, is that if you're in government and you're not allowed to access these channels, you're not allowed to use them, but you're expected to make decisions on the basis of what's being used on social media, what's being said, that becomes difficult. Even the argument over what you should be doing, it's hard to have an informed answer to that if you yourself can't get onto it. And I think for me, that's a big concern. Maybe not so much whether government is on there or not, or whether they're countering these messages or putting alternatives out to these messages, but more that so they have an understanding and are able to act or react based on that understanding.
I think that I read this morning that Taylor Swift has 49 million followers on Twitter. Maybe we need to recruit her. And I'd also like to draw a distinction between counter messaging and alternative messaging. This is purely my point of view. I don't represent any body here. We need to focus on alternative messaging and not counter messaging. When you counter message, you're identifying elements in a message you don't like, and you're trying to undermine them or to retract them or to somehow make them not as powerful. That's probably a fool's errand, because there's a strength in that narrative. It's a reason why it's successful. It does have its strengths.
Yep.
And by trying to counter it, you're doing two things. You're giving it credence, and you're giving the opposition the chance to recounter your counter.
Yeah.
So it becomes something which you simply can't win. You can't win that game. Alternative messaging is very different. It's saying, here's who we are. This is what Canada is. This is what Canada has created. This is what our society has achieved. That, we all agree, is a vastly superior message to the extremist message. That is what we should be putting forward. We should be championing that. We should be saying, we're very proud of what we've done in Canada. And everything we've done will always be better than what they're proposing to do.
That's very interesting, and it certainly resonates with some of the research we're starting to see in this space. One piece was, and both of us were at this event where we heard an academic speak about some of the alternative narratives that are coming out from communities themselves. Again, going back to the initial point we made, the vast majority of these communities where you might get the odd person radicalized and commit violence, the vast majority are against violence. And that vast majority also has a voice. And it was incredible to hear some of the stories and some of the narratives that were within the community against violence. Maybe these voices didn't have at the time an easy route out to be able to offer these alternative narratives. But is that a role that we could play in helping these narratives come out?
Absolutely. If there's going to be a solution, it's not going to come from old white guys like me in the government. We used to say that an almost certain guarantee of failure is to say the government of Canada wants you to do X, or government of Canada says X. And that's not a slander on my colleagues or the government, it's just you don't have the credibility. Those that are going to challenge the narrative, challenge the ideas, the ideology, are people that live it. The people in the communities that see it. They see their children, they see their friends, they see people that are going down this process. They're the ones that have the power to challenge it. They're the ones that have the credibility to challenge it. And credibility is big. I mean, I looked at radicalization for the better part of 15 years, and it was all about who has the most credible voice. Yes. And right now, for better or for worse, the credible voices are with the extremists, or are perceived as being the credible voices. So I think the government does have a role to play. I don't want to just cast them completely out into the lake of despair. The government's role is to foster and to encourage. If necessary, to fund, but that also has to be very, very carefully. If there's a perception that the community is simply repeating a government line, it loses some of its credibility. So I think the government has a role to play in trying to encourage, in dealing with communities, but the message has to be theirs, not ours.
So that's a couple of interesting points. So they are things which we could do better, whether it's enabling that message, whether it's bringing government up to speed and making sure that they have the knowledge about social media and where that's going. I think that's certainly useful. Another piece which we've seen recently, Jamie Bartlett, the Demos researcher, published an op-ed recently to talk about the experience of those who've gone overseas, particularly foreign fighters. And again, talking about some of the bad experiences they've had and the fact that those never seem to get voiced out and shared. Is that potentially another source of an alternative narrative? This is not paradise. Actually, this is pretty bad.
It is and it isn't. I think certainly people who have gone and seen what it's really like are very powerful voices when they return. There's a few problems with that. First of all, is not everybody wants to be that voice. They don't want to necessarily be a public figure to talk about, whether it's fear of threats from their lives or simply desire to put it behind them. I don't want to talk about that anymore. Those that come back with a very negative story and every negative narrative of what they've seen can certainly, in theory, and I'm going to stress that, in theory, perhaps be used to put them against people who are just thinking about these types of things.
Right.
They will be completely discredited by the extremists themselves, whether it's over in Iraq or Syria where they were, or in the UK or Canada, whatever. They'll be seen as those that simply don't get it, or are government stooges, or being paid to say this kind of thing. So I think it does play a role. It has to be managed carefully. Again, it cannot be perceived that, oh, the UK government is putting Kabi out in front because Kabi saw some terrible things in Syria and he wants to tell people, don't do what I did. That loses credibility. So I agree with Jamie. I think, and he writes some amazing stuff, some amazing op-ed pieces. There is a role to be played. It has not been exploited probably as much as it should, but don't overexploit it and do it carefully.
What other areas do you think that we should look at in terms of where else we could improve? Is there anything else that comes to mind that we should work on?
I think some of the programs that I was privy to while I was with the government are bearing a lot of fruit in establishing good relationships with communities, in establishing those types of give and take, getting beyond fear, getting beyond securitization, getting communities to tell their own stories. That's really, really positive. And as we've both been saying throughout the hour here, it's still a very small problem.
Yes.
Like, let's not treat this as the be-all and the end-all threat to Canada. It's a serious problem. It must be dealt with. We've had in the past decade, we've had 4 failed plots, we've had 2 successful plots, and we've had any number of Canadians gone and fight for groups abroad, some of whom may return, and that's the big $64,000 question. Did they come back traumatized? Did they come back fed up? Did they come back wanting to radicalize others? Did they come back wanting to do something or directed to do something? This is all very much a question for security agencies right now, but it's still a relatively small problem. And so how do we do it in such a way that we want to get the best chances of success, but at the same time not give the impression that we're putting all of our eggs in the anti-extremism basket or the anti-radicalization basket? And we have to, treat communities as communities and deal with them not just because we're worried about the 3 or 4 people in Hamilton or St. Catharines or Red Deer that might radicalize to violence. Because they know that. They know why you're coming to talk to them. Trust me, I've seen it. I've seen it firsthand. And if you only come once a year to talk about radicalization, then they see through that pretty clearly. You can't establish a relationship based solely on your concern of terrorism or radicalization.
Those are some great points, Phil. It looks like we still have some work to do.
Absolutely.
We've made some great steps, particularly in Canada. We still do have a relatively low incidence in comparison with some other Western nations. So, we should be thankful for some of these things. But as you said, there are things that we can do better, and I think we certainly should look to see what we can do better sensibly.
And I also think that, knock on wood, we'll never get to that point where we have a large, unmanageable problem. What would it take for Canada to, not to become Syria or Somalia, but what would it take for Canada to become the UK, for example, where you have thousands of people who are radicalizing, and some of whom have gone abroad, and some have carried out attacks on UK soil. I don't see that happening. Maybe I'm just being Pollyannish here, but I don't see the conditions under which we would get that. And it goes back to multiculturalism. It goes back to our ability to integrate people into our society. Yes, with all the warts that it has, we've done it fairly well. I don't see a future Canada where that doesn't work anymore. So let's hope we continue along those lines.
Well, I guess at the end of the day, for all of us as ordinary Canadians, we see the headlines, we see some of the threats that are out there, but we might just be one individual, one citizen. What could an ordinary Canadian do to help?
Wow. That's a great question. I would answer, first and foremost, probably nothing, in the sense that most ordinary Canadians will never face this. They won't face it in their communities. They won't face it in their social milieu. They won't see it in social media. So you don't want to ramp everyone up, because when you do that, you're giving them education and knowledge, but at the same time you're saying, watch your neighbor or watch this. I don't think we want to do that. I think we want to get a generic message out there. We clearly want to deal with communities where we know there's a problem without securitizing it, without stigmatizing it. But the more general, so it's okay to get a general message, but if you sort of ramp it up to almost like a paranoia level, I don't think the results will be good. This is where we get reports where my neighbor's praying 5 times a day.
Well, this is part of our challenge, and I certainly mentioned this in an op-ed a while ago, that really our best defense against what's happening, I didn't quite say is not doing anything, but it's actually to go on out with our lives,
Absolutely.
with our values
Yes.
as Canadians. The fact that we value freedom, we value the cultures and the values of those who come over to Canada, and that we're open and willing to provide anyone and everyone with the opportunities, so long as they want to be part of Canadian society.
And it works. As you said, you're an immigrant. My grandparents immigrated from Eastern Europe 3 generations ago. It works. Yes, it needs constant maintenance, but let's not, sorry, pun intended, blow it up and create something else. Let's work with what we have. And there, as I said, there are reasons why we don't have the level of extremism that other countries have. Call it intangible, call it what you like, but so far so good.
And that's part of the challenge of dealing with terrorism and extremism. Ultimately, the aim of these groups is to change things, whether it's the way we make decisions, a particular act that we're involved with. They want to change us as Canadians. They want to change Canada. So, as you said, maybe the best thing we can do is actually continue to live our lives and do what we do as Canadians, rather than giving in to the paranoia and the fear, because that would be, in essence, a partial victory for some of those who espouse these extremist views and these behaviors.
Terrorists want to impose change. I mean, terrorism comes from terror. It comes from making people frightened. The solution is to let CSIS do what it does. Let the RCMP do what it does. They do it very well. As I said earlier, they're incredibly devoted and professional people that work there. They do a good job. General awareness, but let's make it the number one topic we need to talk about all the time, because we don't have to.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. I'm just going to take a peek at social media at our Twitter feed, in case we have any questions for us. Well, Phil, this has been a fascinating conversation. It's been 30 years since we had to deal with Air India 182. I think certainly the repercussions of that incident are still being felt today by those who remember the victims who are on board. As we've said before, I think the best thing that we can do in terms of combating terrorism is making sure that these acts do not change us, that we continue to do what we do as Canadians, that we continue to enjoy those freedoms, and that we don't let acts of terror determine our course of action. Certainly, we need to do a few things that will help make us safer. There are things we can do better, and hopefully, through the work of the intelligence services, law enforcement, we can continue to improve on those fronts. Hopefully, some of the research that we're doing on some of the question marks we have, for example, what are the trigger points that actually get someone to act violently, even though they may have radical thoughts or espouse radical media. Those sorts of things we certainly need to do more work on. But at the end of the day, we have done rather well, and we have to make sure that we stay that way.
I think it's really important to stress that, Gabi. I mean, there's always room for improvement. We're talking about human systems, organizations that are staffed by humans. So there's always room for doing things a little better, as you said. But let's give ourselves, as you said, let's give ourselves credit. We've done a really good job so far, and let's not introduce changes that are going to make it either less efficient or maybe a little over efficient, in a sense that you start to target larger groups that don't really warrant targeting. So absolutely, let's make changes where they need to be.
Exactly.
And leave what's working, let it work.
Especially with making sure that we don't forget some of the other extremist groups who are out there, like the right wing, like the potential for Sikh extremism with what happened in 1985, and other groups who might be out there, the sovereign citizen type movements. We do have other groups which we need to be concerned about. I think that's part of the lesson is, if there is one thing that does need to be changed, it's maybe remembering that there are other concerns that we also need to be aware of in the whole milieu of extremism.
And today's anniversary is an excellent day to remind ourselves of that. You know, as an intelligence analyst, you're obviously worried about what you know. And I'm not going to get all Rumsfeldian on you here, but you know, we know that CSIS and the RCMP have moved resources from other problems to, you know, the Al-Qaeda inspired problem. That's public knowledge, and rightfully so. But you're always worried about the things you're not looking at. And so this is the threat du jour. This is the number one threat. But as you mentioned, there are other threats out there, and we need to find a way that we're keeping an eye on those at the same time. They don't constitute as much of a threat right now, but again, with what happened in Charleston this week, where you've had a horrendous slaughter of people, and it wasn't an American Muslim. It was some young white man who happened to think that white supremacy was the way to go.
Well, I think we're going to call our conversation to an end. I hope that those of you who've managed to join us have had some insights shared today, which you can take away with you. The recording of this discussion, the video, will be posted on our website once we're done editing it and compressing it. For those of you on Periscope, you can jump over to YouTube. This is not an advertisement for either one of these technologies, but you will be able to see the video on a number of other channels as well post-event. It's 23rd June 2015, 30 years since Air India 182 was destroyed on its way to London Heathrow. If nothing else, we've learned that the threat of terrorism is broad, it can vary, and we must be aware of all of the risks out there, but we must also remember at the same time that in certain areas we have done a good job. It's a hard act to balance, but we hope that our efforts in making sure that Canada and Canadians remain safe from the threat of terrorism will be the best memorial we can give to those 329 lives lost on 23rd of June 1985. Thank you very much.